Okay, thank y'all very much for tuning in, and hope everybody's had a good week and that nobody got bothered by the storms that we had earlier today. So tonight is kind of an addition from the text. This is not necessarily covered in the text, even though we'll kind of go back to something that was kind of talked about in the text a little bit. But I am looking forward to this class because we get to talk about some interesting topics tonight here in PA 509, Applied Political Economy. I will give some time for questions before we get into it, but I do want to go over the overview first. Tonight, we're going to cover two topics that it's not my intention to get you to necessarily believe in the first one. I feel, however, given where public policy is going, and especially where public policy has gone over the last 2 years, I feel it's important to have a discussion about this because we are living through kind of the early experiment into this concept, and that is modern monetary theory. You could easily argue that some of the things that have happened over the last 2 years in the COVID response and the policy response to COVID tie directly to the concept of modern monetary theory, and now we're dealing with the ramifications of that. And then I wanted to go back and revisit the topic of behavioral economics because I do think there's a lot to learn here. Like I said, I think in the first time that I talked about this, the folks at Duke have an entire program focused on behavioral economics. They do that along with play basketball, and they have a great medical school. I will say that they do great in the area of medicine. But along with basketball, their college also does behavioral economics, and they do a lot in that area, and I do think it's important for us to kind of look at this again. So I do want to kind of cover this a little bit and get some feedback from you. So before I begin with the lecture, are there any questions that anybody has regarding anything else going on in class or anything else going on? Okay, just like the end of the semester, just as we go towards the later half of the semester, everybody's nice and quiet. So I get that, no problem. So if any questions do come up, we'll have some time to discuss that at the end. So first of all, I did pull this definition directly from Investopedia and modify it a little bit. What is modern monetary theory? You've had a chance to watch some videos, I hope, that I had available in the week 11 packet. But really, there's this concept that's also known as Keynesian economics, which is the idea that that government spending or that centralized spending can enable greater economic demand. It's more of a demand-based model, but that by the government creating demand for services and products, it has the potential to be able to spur the economy. Modern monetary theory kind of takes the Keynesian approach and puts it on steroids because what it basically says is that those nations, and the US is one of them, but it also mentions Japan, Canada, pretty much your G7, G8 nations, which would also include the United Kingdom, France, basically your highly industrialized legacy nations, even if they're in some period of decline, as Dalio talked about in his book. Those nations that can spend, tax, and borrow in a fiat currency that they fully control, they are not operationally constrained by revenues when it comes to federal government spending. What that really means is they can borrow theoretically an unlimited amount. This concept has been around for a while. It was actually, I think, developed in the 1800s, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, but really has come into vogue in the last couple of years. An economics student, an individual who graduated with a degree in economics by the name of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez subscribes to this. This is what she promotes in terms of what she says, even though she doesn't really talk specifically about modern monetary theory. She studied this in college, she's the biggest proponent of it, as are several other people in elected office. And it really drives the idea that the ongoing debate that we have about deficits and debt when it comes to government, at least at the federal level, not the state or local, but at the federal level, really doesn't matter all that much. I had the opportunity several years back to actually attend a conference where we had somebody who was one of the more stronger proponents of this concept actually come and speak at the conference and made some very interesting points. And really what it comes down to is that if the government controls basically the supply of money, i.e. the supply of currency that is available in the economy, and we are pretty much a monetized economy in this country, then it has the ability to decide pretty much what that supply is going to be. It has various levers and controls to be able to make sure that you do not have the negative effect that can occur, which is inflation. And obviously, the biggest challenge that you have in any kind of monetary system is the impact of inflation. We're living through that now with the way that inflation is going. Overall, I wouldn't be surprised if official inflation numbers get above 8% nationally. They're already in the South for wage earners, not salary workers, but for hourly wage workers at 9%. And that's before you look at pre-1982 numbers, which say they could be upwards of 12 to 13% on a year-to-year basis, which we haven't seen since the 1970s, basically about the time I was born. So the reality is that if this exists, where the idea that the government can necessarily borrow as much as it needs, it's based on kind of a broader principle that all currency is debt. That when the government issues currency, whether it effectively borrows it or not, it is effectively debt. And so I don't want to get into it gets a little more murky after that point, but the idea being that what you're doing is creating a debt that leads to a credit from the standpoint of the services and the material that it can buy. So there are different ways of looking at this model, but the one that I found most effective is this one here, which looks at your typical bathroom sink, particularly the ones I see in the bathrooms here in North Carolina State. You have your bathroom, you have the faucet, which is government spending. The water in this example would be the new money, whereas the sink serves as the economy. And really the goal is to make sure that the water that's in the sink doesn't go over, that the flow of water and that the amount of water that's going into the sink does not end up running over. When it runs over, as you see in this example of dripping, or as in the case we're seeing right now, where it's deluging over it, wetting the floor and possibly flowing down to the lower levels, that's inflation. And again, when we talk about inflation, easily to understand, inflation means there's too much money going after too few goods. It's a supply problem from the standpoint of supply of money. It's a demand problem from the standpoint there's too much demand for too small supply of goods that our money can buy. So you necessarily need a drain. Now, if you notice here, it specifically says there is an available drain. And that is in the form of taxes. That the government can use taxes to be able to pull money back out of the economy, not necessarily to pay debt, even though it can be used to do that. But what really the taxes do is that it enables to control the supply of money available in the open market and hopefully be an effective hedge against inflation, or an effective action against inflation. Now, from a broader perspective, this is an example of fiscal policy, which is controlled by the government. This is not an example of monetary policy. What's an example of monetary policy?
The Fed's buying assets, stuff like that.
That's an example. What's another action the Fed can take? And I'll go online for this. What's another example the Fed can take with respect to monetary policy?
I couldn't hear if Ian said to change interest rates. We could do something around that.
Right, interest rates is the primary vehicle that they do that. There's another method that they sometimes use. What is that?
Quantitative easing.
Quantitative easing, but there's also something they do with the banks. Anybody remember that one? If you are a federally insured bank, you have to keep a certain amount of money in reserve. And what the Fed can do is tell you that you have to keep more money or less money in reserve. So that's an example, another example. That's a more antiquated term, but they do use it from time to time. But those are examples of monetary policy. And monetary policy is less controlled by the government and more controlled by the Federal Reserve. It's important to remember that the Federal Reserve is an independent agency. The only way that the government controls the Federal Reserve is that the president appoints the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And it's to a multi-year term that often transcends between administrations. The Congress does not really have any control, even though they can call them in to testify. The federal government, the Congress doesn't really have much control. They are kind of an independent agency. And so that's why there's oftentimes those who have problems with the Federal Reserve and the fact that they control the money supply kind of talk about the issues like auditing the Fed, doing other types of actions to try to find out what's really going on. But this graph here really, I think, explains in general what modern monetary theory is. It's the idea, backed up based on their logic, that the government can decide how much money is out there. And if it decides to print too much or decides to make too much available in the open market, either through government spending, and government spending here is a very broad term. The tax incentive or the tax credits that we receive in the form of bonus payments that we got during COVID would be an example of government spending. The various pieces of legislation that were passed during COVID to provide supplemental or relief funds was an example of government spending. The annual budget's an example of government spending, but it's with the idea that these limitations that we often talk about, like debt limits, debt ceiling, the national debt overall, and how we try to compare it with respect to GDP, really aren't that important. What's really important is understanding, do we have enough money? Do we have too much money that we create inflation because we're going after too few goods, both public and private market going after them? Or are we in a different situation? Because their argument is that when you try to contract the money supply too much through monetary policy, which is what the Federal Reserve is trying to do to some degree with its interest rate hikes that it's put in place, it has the potential to create a circumstance where there's too much goods and not enough money, and that can lead to a recession. So their argument would be that really all that matters is inflation. Now, there have been times in our history globally where inflation was uncontrollable. And when you look at those situations where that was the case, it was in circumstances typically where the governments were not in a position to be able to control their currency. Some people bring up the more recent examples like Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Neither country is really in a position to be able to control its own currency. They aren't really a global standard. I talked about before how the US is considered a reserve currency. There's a lot of international transactions that only take effect in dollars. Putin's trying to challenge that right now. The Chinese would like to challenge that. But the reality is that a lot of transactions only occur in US dollars. So it provides some additional stability and certainty with respect to our money. You look at what happened to Germany after the First World War, where it was significantly penalized by the Allied nations for its initiation of the First World War. and was put into a situation where the only way it could get itself out of it was to basically print as much money as possible. The problem was that it was a debtor nation, it wasn't a creditor nation. Even though we borrow more than we pay than we take in, we're still not really a debtor nation. That led to a massive inflationary spike, which unfortunately led rise to the Third Reich. So the reality is that this theory has, like any theory, it does try to use history, it does try to use concept, does try to use logic to make a point. So as we think about it, and based on both the podcast that I had you listen to, which was a YouTube video because Bloomberg decided to paywall the podcast I was going to give y'all. So think about this. What are some specific examples? And I kind of mentioned the recovery, but think of some other examples that are out there of modern monetary theory in action. What are they?
Well, Professor, I could think of an example of it not in action. Perhaps, during the Eurozone crisis, where none of the EU countries would let, Greece, Italy, Portugal have their own, sort of like QE or like their own sort of currency policies because they're all tied into that. And that a lot of people argue that prolonged all of the debt crises in those countries and had influences on the Middle East crisis, et cetera, et cetera.
The idea that those other countries like Germany or France could have used their position to be able to transact currency, to be able to relieve Greece and Italy and a couple of other small nations of their debt. That's a good example in reverse. What's an example of where it could conceivably be in place? One that may be affecting some of you right now. So I don't want to assume.
Is it the stimulus checks?
Stimulus checks is definitely one. Drew is right. Student loans. So the stimulus checks is definitely one, but the student loans is a kind of a reverse one. So the president announced, I believe it was yesterday, that he's extending the deferment moratorium on student loans to the end of August. Basically, at that point, it'll mean that most people who hold student loans will not have paid anything on them, or at least public loans that are due to the Department of Education for over 2 years. Now, there are people within the liberal or Democrat establishment, and certainly people like AOC, that would love to see those loans forgiven. From the standpoint, that would be a massive government expenditure, particularly the government having to pay the guarantees on those loans to the banks that take out private loans. But public loans, obviously, that's still expenditure because you're taking what you expect to receive and you're basically saying, we're just going to wipe that out. That would be that's a very good example of modern monetary theory in action. Or the idea of then going further than that and saying that we're going to make college at the 4-year level or even at the 2-year level free. At the 2-year level, it's a little less because you can kind of control the cost, but when you deal with it, because 2-year colleges are for the most part public, and you can just basically say you've got a set budget, you're going to operate this. But when you're looking at 4-year schools, when you provide it as a property right, i.e., someone has the option of a 4-year education, and you make it available in a diversified market where there's private options available, you're basically creating an unlimited market. What's another example?
I think the child care tax credit, I think it was, that was promoted in tandem with the stimulus checks would definitely be one. And then I'm wondering, would you consider something like the housing first approach to end homelessness to be under modern monetary theory?
It would absolutely have to be implemented because you'd have absolutely no control of the market. That would be a case, Holly, and that's an excellent one. And Jessica, I'll get to you in a second. That would be a case that you would have to basically, the government would not be able to set the price with respect to how much it requires housing for people in a housing first approach, because it would be totally susceptible to the market. If it decides to create a guarantee, and this has been the concern with healthcare, but even not to the same degree because housing is even more hyperbolic because supply is directly constrained. Whereas in medical care, there's ability to expand supply theoretically. In housing, that's even more challenged because land specifically is constrained. That would be something to have to go to. Jessica?
I didn't necessarily have an example, just more of like one of the videos stated where sometimes the government will take more jobs out of the private sector and into the public to try to give like job opportunity. And I was just trying to understand when it talks about how it's easier to grow programs, like government programs, but it's harder to shrink them. Like,
Well, it's naturally harder to shrink government programs, particularly if they are programs that provide a service. When it comes to programs that are capital in nature, it can be easier to trying to think here the right way to put it. It can be easier to shrink them. That was the case with the New Deal programs, because most of those were capital in nature. We were building sidewalks, we were building dams, we were building all kinds of things. You can just decide we're not going to build anymore. When you create a service like education or programs for certain populations, those become harder to prevent due to political influences, and also because there's no necessary end to it. There's no terminus to the program. So that can be a bigger challenge as well. But you made an excellent point. Theoretically, the government could redirect its focus on spending to employment, which has been done in our history. It was done in the 1930s during the New Deal. It was done in the 1970s during the Carter administration with various internship and various programs where the federal government, in kind of a one-time deal, actually paid for people to enter public service employment. It was a very short-lived program in the 1970s. We have it to some degree now in the COPS grant program, which exists. And this is where the federal government provides money to local law enforcement agencies to hire police officers. They cover it for a couple of years. Theoretically, the officer is then, the costs are then borne primarily by the local government, totally by the local government after a set period of time. That was established with the crime bill that passed over the Clinton administration in the 1990s. There was actually a heightened version of it created during the Obama administration as one of the Recovery Act programs. There was somebody else who had a question. Does anybody else have a question?
Oh, I did.
Okay, Shannon.
I was trying to think about this at like the international level, and I was wondering if modern monetary theory is related to like the IMF or like the World Bank at all. Like, would that be another example? Because the IMF is like, they create money to give to the IMF, which then goes towards foreign countries to create jobs and monetary stabilization. So I wasn't sure if that counted at all.
It can, depending on how the money is done. I mean, theoretically, the loans are paid back. Theoretically, the nations that receive IMF funding are supposed to pay those loans back. They don't always do that, but it could kind of be construed as something. So let's go from there. Let's talk about advantages. What are some advantages of modern monetary theory?
For one, it can increase the amount of like public spending that the economy is in. The economy can grow the public sector, which is generally, bringing people into higher wage, higher security jobs and less precarious, which I think is a good idea.
Right. Yeah. Theoretically, you're correct. Catherine?
I was pretty much going to say the same thing. You're not constrained. If a project comes up that would really be beneficial, you're not constrained by the amount of money you have.
Right. You're not having to prioritize or necessarily limit spending. I mean, I'm working on a budget right now for my city, and the challenge that I have is that, of course, I'm not in a position to be able to issue currency, so I can only grow my government the amount that I have to balance with revenue. But the fact is that I've got more needs and I've got resources available to serve them. So if I'm in that position, but again, the federal government could decide, look, we want to serve all of our needs. Samantha says it allows government the ability to address social issues like homelessness. Yes, it allows it to target different ones. Typically those like Ms. Kelton, when she talked in her videos, or others will talk about, that really this provides the resources necessary for the government to be able to address certain long-term or strategic issues without necessarily worrying about how to pay for it, which is oftentimes the question, because a lot of these problems are rather significant and have significant price tags associated to it. Some of the talk has been with respect to climate change. Any other advantages?
Kind of to that point, it would allow, taking the housing first example that I introduced, it would allow, if you're fully, leaning into that program or that policy, you are able to see what the full longer term impact would be without being restricted by funding it. So, some studies that I've read on that program in particular argue that while it is a large investment at the front, you may save money in the long term by having, when people are safely housed, they will not be putting as much of a burden on the healthcare industry, for example. So you
Sure.
can kind of see those longer term impacts.
Right, the idea being that what you're doing is that you're front loading the cost and that theoretically you could achieve savings long term. Morgan?
So kind of less of a practical advantage, but what I'm thinking of in the video where she goes through looking at the deficit and the surplus over time, and then there were the 4 years around the Clinton era where we really championed running the budget like a household budget, and it kind of didn't work out the way everyone thought. So it sort of provides a more real explanation for why that's what happened, because everyone thought running it like a household budget was just going to be the best thing that we could possibly do. So that explanation, I think, is helpful.
Yes, I mean, theoretically, the thing to remember with respect to that period of time was the fact that we were kind of in a paradigm shifting movement. I talked about before, really the last true paradigm shifting situation with respect to the economy, because we had the launch of the internet. And that, of course, dramatically changed. We also had the launch really of broadly accepted globalization. And those two factors created a tremendous amount of revenue. And conceivably, that kind of created a situation, because I don't necessarily believe that Clinton and his folks were expecting this, but the fact was that you had a situation where tax rates were increased. Then you subsequently had a reduction in welfare spending due to welfare reform. So it was kind of a perfect storm situation. It wasn't engineered that way, but once it started moving in that direction, everybody jumped on the bandwagon and said, yeah, let's go for this. As Kelton talks about, there were various negative externalities associated with it. Karen also brings up an important part, is that it allows you, with respect to spending, really focus on investment. Which I can tell you, when you look at the issue of underinvestment, particularly from an equity perspective, there are a lot of parts of the country that have just simply not kept up. And we generally look at that as a wasted opportunity. There's a fact that you are wasting economic growth potential by not making those places economically feasible, or making those places be more prepared for broader private investment. And so the loss of those areas due to underinvestment over time, and the fact that they need help with things like environmental remediation, housing, other forms of infrastructure is essential. So let's talk about disadvantages. What are some disadvantages of modern monetary theory? Okay, inflation. Curtis, you want to say something?
That's literally what I was getting ready to say. You have to really keep a tight rein on inflation.
And how does, based on the example I showed, how do you do that?
You'd have to be involved in a lot of policy making.
Right, particularly with taxes. So the White House is taking its own stand in the upcoming budget for fiscal year 23 with a proposal that kind of deals with this from a fiscal policy perspective. What are they proposing? Seeing if anybody's checked out the news lately. Right, yeah, it's also been criticized as inadequate. That's absolutely true, Tira. So the fact of the matter is that the White House is proposing some significant tax rate increases in certain areas. They want to add a value tax with respect to wealth of with respect to ownership of investments. They want to look at some other taxes. They're not talking about raising income taxes per se, but they want to try to target some taxes in particular groups. And this is not necessarily intended to be punitive, but it's intended to be a fiscal, you could argue that it's intended to be a fiscal policy solution to try to be another counterweight against inflation. Now, the real challenge is that while there is some inflation being created by those on the higher end, the reality is that inflation is really being driven by the fact that there's a lot of money in the general population. And we're not talking about raising taxes on any of y'all. Now, there's some people that argue that inflation is a tax itself, particularly when it's facilitated and manipulated by government policy. But the fact is, it's not a direct tax. I don't know of anybody right now, any government, local, state, federal, except Wake County, because it needs to pay bond issues, that's talking about raising taxes. Certainly not the North Carolina General Assembly, because right now it would never talk about raising taxes. Also, as Lydia points out, it assumes a 0-point employment rate, which is possible, and it assumes that a 0% unemployment rate is possible, which would cause the public sector to grow too quickly. That's also true. We have to remember, while it's important that we have a public sector, it's also important to remember that there is some utility loss to the broader economy when people are shifted from the public sector to the private sector. The idea being is that the public sector serves the private sector. The public sector serves the government. So it can't be a situation where everybody is supporting, where the majority is supporting a minority. It can't work that way. You got to have most people in the private sector. There's a balance to be had in that. Any other disadvantages?
I don't know if this is a disadvantage per se, but just thinking about all of the different issues that could be addressed through MMT, there would be trade-offs for all of them and differing priorities for what to like inject with all of this money. So I mean, I don't know if that's a disadvantage, but it would be a tricky decision to make.
Yeah, absolutely, because the fact is, at what point does the government's desire to try to correct solutions create more problems than it's trying to solve? That's absolutely true. I truly believe, certainly with respect to taxation, there's only so much taxation that that the economy can bear before you have collapse. At the same time, there's also so much government, the idea being is how much can the government spend, how much government spending can you have in the total economy before the government collapses? The Soviets proved that you can't run at 100% government spending and have a lasting economy. They did it for a while, but the government cannot control all the economy. We know that to be true. We also know that the government has to be there for something. So the question is, where is the balance? And some people would argue that that's really the concern, is at what point, how much of the economy is under the control directly of government spending. This was one of the biggest concerns with respect to the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't the fact that the government it wasn't the fact that it was going to cost too much. It was the question of, is the government, by controlling a significant segment of total economic activity, necessarily creating a circumstance where it's going to cause problems, and the fact that it's consuming too much of the economy overall. So understanding these advantages and disadvantages and seeing what we've seen in this brief, and from a period of the overall time, this is a very brief experiment that we've done with modern monetary theory. This is just an opinion. There's no right or wrong answer. Is it actually feasible? What are your thoughts?
Was actually raising my hand.
Okay, go ahead.
What we were discussing, but I think it kind of applies to this question. When I was listening to the TED Talk and so forth, I wondered if the TVA was in some ways actually applying modern monetary theory. We focused on it as a coordination problem, but there certainly was a government investment that went right and went wrong.
Well, and it's got a debt that'll never be paid back, and Congress will continue to make sure about that. The tens of billions of dollars they borrowed for nuclear plants that were never constructed. That's an interesting example. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority. There's a smaller one, the Bonneville Power Authority out west, but you have the TVA. Being from Tennessee, I come from TVA country. You have the situation where the federal government, in an effort to improve the life of people in a very broad area from Kentucky all the way down to Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, basically assumed control of power. They actually forced out private power providers. They basically built a massive power distribution network, and they basically allocated localized distribution to municipalities and to power cooperatives. It's all publicly owned. And it became responsible for doing that. Now, theoretically, I would argue that it's not, because the operations of TVA are not necessarily subsidized. The cost, if the cost of TVA were being subsidized, then you make an excellent point. But in modern terms, the cost of TVA are not being subsidized. The one caveat to that is that back in the 1970s, TVA borrowed tens of billions of dollars to build out a massive network of nuclear power plants, which ended up never getting built. That is basically bad debt that sits on the books that continues to be refunded and refinanced by the federal government and will be into millennia. So you could argue in one way, yes, the TVA is subsidized because it never has to pay back the principal on tens of billions of dollars in debt. If it had to, then power rates would go up significantly. So you could argue that that is a subsidy. Theoretically, that's MMT in action. But you could also argue against it because theoretically, its operations, the TVA does, from the standpoint of its ongoing operations, cover its costs for the most part. There are some things that it does that have to do with flood control, that have to do with operations of other ancillary facilities that are a little bit subsidized by the government. But yes, that's a good case study in itself, Karen. So so that's a very small example, but is this actually feasible at a broader perspective, looking at it from the perspective of the economy of the US as a whole? Is it feasible? Why or why not?
So one argument that some people make, I don't know if I necessarily agree with this, but both the Senate and the House passed a resolution saying that they did not endorse MMT. And one of the points they brought up is that it might hurt foreign confidence in the ability of the US to like repay its debts. If like places like China, they own lots of US currency. So there might be some confidence lost in that respect.
Absolutely, because eventually the supply of money you need just to make the interest payments on the debt becomes so significant that theoretically you're using a huge percentage of your budget to pay for that. I mean, that's the concern under current conditions that I have with our deficit and our debt, is that our debt is primarily financed with short-term notes. Most is financed under 3 years. And because of that, we get a relatively low interest rate. Of course, right now we're seeing interest rates go up. But generally speaking, we're still paying overall on our national debt less than 3%. When we talk about Greece and Italy, they went bankrupt at 6%. But you think about that for the US, if you go to 6%, that's double the payment just on the interest, not even talking about the principal. So the question is really, how far could you take it and it'd be structurally feasible with respect to establishing, because at the end of the day, even if we issue debt, someone still has to buy it. And even though, like right now, one of the other actions that the Fed is taking from a monetary policy perspective is that it's going to go back out there and reduce its balance sheet, which could have an even more significant effect than what's doing with interest rates. But the Federal Reserve has several $1 trillion in assets that's bought, including US Treasuries, that are out there that need to be sold, and that's going to gobble up money supply as well. So there's a lot of concern. Generally, I think if you look at it from a conventional perspective, the Fed took its action way too late and is now trying to play catch up, and that does have the potential of causing a recession. The Fed should have ended the asset sales last year and should have slowly gone into interest rate, but it should have been doing that a year ago once we knew that we had vaccines and once we knew that we were going to be moving in an upward position last year. They didn't do that. So what we see now is a situation where they're trying to play catch up, and that's what oftentimes leads you to problems. There was an article I read about a week ago that talked about that there have been 9 economic cycles since 1964 or so where the Fed has had to raise interest rates to be able to deal with inflation. In 8 of those circumstances, it's led to recession. So the law of averages don't look too good with respect to what they're doing now. Any other thoughts with respect to feasibility?
I just had kind of a question of how dual mandate, I think that's dual, just like, I guess your thoughts or the class's thoughts on if that's feasible, because I think if I understood correctly, it was saying just trying to have not making interest rates so high and also keeping employment, I think employment, everyone able to find employment. And
Yeah, that's the challenge that the Fed has. It's this dual mandate approach, which is that it's dealing with both inflation and employment. Right now, it's seeing no problems with employment. We've actually seen employment grow significantly. Jobless claims are down to lows we haven't seen in a long time, prior when there was a much smaller percentage of the public in the workplace. And at the same time, inflation is going gangbusters. The question is, at what point does that swap where we've been able to tame inflation, but then we have a problem on the jobs front? The fact is, full employment and the idea of zero unemployment is not necessarily feasible. Nor is it necessarily, it's not feasible from the perspective that, as we've seen, typically in times of low unemployment, you start to see a lot of job shifting. You start to see already with low unemployment, you see circumstances where employers are not able to hire because their business models don't allow them to be in a position to be able to offer wages competitive enough to enable people to take work. Now, this gets into a behavioral economic perspective that we'll talk about next. But the fact is, even if there is unemployment, there's still going to be people that are willing to sit on the sidelines because they look at the circumstance and they go, I can still make more money. And to them, it's not worth it to go ahead and make the money they can make now. It would be better to be available to make more money or be in a better working position somewhere else. So it is a challenging dual mandate. And typically that means that you reach this quasi full employment level, which is around 3 to 4 or 5%. So usually around 3 to 4% is considered full employment. You try to reach that and at the same time try to control inflation, but typically trying to do that can be very difficult. Holly, yes.
Just back to the question of the feasibility of MMT, I don't think I'm necessarily in a position to argue fully against or for, but I do think that we can take some of, I guess, the underlying principles of modern monetary theory and put them into practice, and that's something that I would support to prioritize public investment to maintain a standard of safety or meeting everyone's basic needs, and kind of putting the question of, are people safe over how are we going to pay for things?
So basically trying to broaden the idea of a safety net to include other material rights to ensure, is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah, like a people first approach to policy and putting more of a priority into making sure that people have healthcare, people are housed, they're able to access and afford food and education and things of that nature. I don't know where I stand. I would have to do more research on looking towards just kind of not being concerned about the deficit and using the MMT theory. I know there's debate for proponents of MMT versus people who would like to kind of more progressively tax based on income and using those differences to fund public programs. I'm just not as familiar with MMT.
Yeah, and it's a challenge. And again, that's the reason why I wanted to bring it forward to y'all, because I do believe regardless of any apprehensions that I might have or that others have, this is going to become a more discussed topic. When you look at where federal budgets have gone in the last couple of years, this is definitely already in place to some extent. I would not say fully, but certainly in place to some extent, because particularly when you look at the current budget, the concept of deficit is not a major concern. And generally speaking, that budget has some parts of that budget have a pretty good chance of passing, because typically that happens in a lame duck year. So we'll just have to see what happens. But the reality is that it is a concept that deserves your attention as you move forward in your career, because it is going to influence federal policy. It will likely lead to this greater, particularly if you work at the local level or you work in nonprofits, it will lead to this greater level of engagement from the federal government directly into local governments. We've seen that with recovery. We saw that with the rescue plan. We've seen it with the subsequent legislation that was passed, the transportation bill, and we're seeing it even with the federal budget that's coming forward. And if Build Back Better had passed, we would have seen it to a certain extent with that as well. So there's definitely a lot there. Holly, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, no, sorry.
Just want to make sure. Okay. So I hope this was a good overview and kind of gave you some better understanding of what we are talking about with respect to MMT. Next, we're going to talk about behavioral economics. And as we talked about earlier in this semester, when we talk about behavioral economics, it's basically a method of economic analysis that attempts to apply psychological insights into human behavior to explain economic decision making. In other words, help us understand, why do humans act irrationally? That should be humans, not human. Sorry about that. Because a lot of study in economics is this idea of perfect, like with MMT, the idea of zero unemployment. But the reality is, as I mentioned with my one example, humans don't necessarily go that. In other words, theoretically, if there's jobs available, people will take the job that's available if it aligns at all with their skills or abilities. We're seeing right now with the Great Resignation that that's not necessarily the case. And so what we're trying to understand is, why is it that things don't work necessarily perfect? And a lot of that gets into the discussions of political economy that the author of the text has talked about this throughout. And I think that gets a lot into it from a behavioral perspective. Because in a standard economic model, you have this concept of deliberation without limit, which leads to behavior leading to outcomes that provides the information for further deliberation. So it's a continuous circle that's supposed to work like a well-oiled machine. However, the example on the right really gives us an idea of how it works, because really you have two different systems of thinking. You kind of have your automatic approach, or the all-id approach, as it's known by psychologists, and then you have the more deliberative approach, which is more in line with the concepts associated with standard economics. So, for example, let's say I was buying a car, and deliberatively I would be trying to find the best value for the best price. I would be focusing on the various features I have, and I would be trying to make the best deal that I possibly could based on the options that are available. And I might be even willing to wait and make other alternative options if if I felt like there was a limit to what I could do. Whereas on the automatic approach, it's just like, I need a car today, just give me something. Or as that meme says, shut up and take my money. And so that behavior can be driven by one of two or a combination of different ways of thinking. And what it does then is it leads to these outcomes, which also include shared mental models. Because as we've seen, particularly with elections, even though we're all unique, typically we all kind of flow in, there's certain ways and directions that we flow into as groups. And in some cases you have information, but in a lot of cases, some information is filtered out and it goes away. And a lot of times that can be definitely the case in politics. Not everything is necessarily feedbacked in. Some things are ignored, or some things are pushed aside, where biases go into play. So are there any thoughts or questions with respect to this particular diagram, these particular diagrams? Okay. So if we look at it on a chart, and I know I haven't used a lot of charts here, but I did want to use this one. This is an example of understanding behavioral economics, because in a perfect economic model, that line would not have a curve to it, it would be completely linear. Whereas, however, when we look at it behaviorally speaking, there is an understanding that there are diminishing return values with respect to the overall impact of certain behaviors. So in this particular case, it involves a $100 bill. So let's say you're at the gym or at the grocery store, wherever the case may be, and you lose $100. Now, there is certainly a loss to that, and that loss is felt, but it's actually felt at a value faster. It's more logarithmic in the fact that it's actually felt faster at a point before you get to it from a linear perspective. But as you can see, that rate diminishes. Whereas if you gain $100, yes, you would get a faster value of utility. But once you reach the $100 point, then that value of utility goes down. The growth in utility goes down. So this creates a diminishing return factor with respect to this. So this helps us understand how behavior actually goes, because even if you were to say, go further, let's say you got $200, that increment between 100 and 200 is not linear. It's actually less. And you think about it, $100, that's a big deal, but $200 is not double the impact, does not necessarily from a behavioral perspective feel like double the impact of $100. And the same would be true with losing money. This kind of explains gambling, because somebody doesn't necessarily see from a behavioral perspective, and it helps explain why some people get into addiction and bet large amounts. Even though they're betting more money, it doesn't necessarily mean that they feel a greater degree of loss. And in fact, what could happen is even if they bet small, they look at it not as much as a gain, but as a loss on what they could have bet, even if they win. Not that I have any experience with that. I stick to horses. But so are there any questions with respect to this model?
Professor, would this also depend on the relative income or wealth of the person? So like maybe
Yes.
to a person who's on very low fixed income, that that gain curve is going to be like much higher than perhaps
Absolutely, and that can help explain behavior. That can help explain, for example, there's a lot of socially speaking, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the purchasing decisions of lower income people. And it's viewed that, well, you really shouldn't do certain things because there are certain behaviors traditionally associated with people at lower incomes in terms of their purchasing habits that are noted with respect to higher incomes. And the question is, why is that the case? Well, the reality is that even though it's a small amount of money, it still is a significant share, but it creates a significant value of utility for them. And so and it helps them with respect to overall. So yes, that's farther below, but you would see the significant utility gain, even a small amount of money being spent, even though somebody could argue you're still spending money you don't necessarily have to spend. Anything else? Okay. So I wanted to show you some examples here. And so I'm going to link to this, website that show behavioral science. And like, I wanted to show one. So this kind of gets into some, first, let me show you that there was one. Okay, let me just show you this one. So this one kind of shows you some impact of behavioral economics. Dr. Thaler, who wrote this in 2013, actually received the Nobel Prize in economics for his work in this area, understanding retirement savings. And what it talks about is it's about this concept known as auto enrollment with 401k plans. The idea being that if employers purposely go ahead and enroll, even if they have to make the contribution for employees into 401k plans, theoretically, what it does is it actually encourages savings. And what you can see here is that over time, as auto enrollment increased, it automatically led to an escalation in savings rates. So that's an important one to look at. This one, there's actually one that's been done more recently with respect to common perceptions. People have a certain conception about, say, the top 20%. The estimated perception is that it's about a little under 60% that they hold over still less than 60% of the wealth. It's over 50% of the wealth. In reality, it's around 85% of the wealth in this country. This was back in 2011. It's probably greater now. And that ideally, while the top 20% definitely wouldn't hold 20% of the wealth, the idea being that, well, theoretically, they should only have about a third of it, which has never happened. This one was very interesting, looking at behavior with respect to electric usage. And looking at how people use electricity. It was interesting that electric usage actually was higher prior to a Super Bowl as opposed to during the Super Bowl, because everybody's in one room focused on the TV. And that actually shows the impact of electric usage. So it was interesting to understand it. And people would think there'd be more electric consumption, but it's in the winter, so you're not using a lot of air conditioning. And most people are in one room, so all the lights are off, the appliances are on. They're using more getting ready for the game and in the pregame than they're necessarily using during the game itself. Let's see if there's one else here. See, there's one I was trying to see. But this is an interesting one to look at. I don't know if there's really any other ones I want to look at directly, but this is interesting with respect to looking at this, and you can look at it at your leisure, but really trying to understand what is going on with behavioral science and behavioral economics. So let's look at it. And I kind of led. Let's take behavioral economics and now apply it to MMT. What does it mean with respect to modern monetary theory? How do we take what we learn from behavioral economics and apply it to modern monetary theory?
Well, this could be kind of going against modern monetary theory by understanding MMT works best when the money is allocated properly, but understanding like behavioral economics shows us that people don't always behave practically. So there's a good chance that the money won't go towards like the most practical like infrastructure development projects, if that makes sense. Yes,
because absolutely, because the way that we've used modern monetary theory is that we've just given it out to the public. This was something that, so after 9/11, we actually did kind of our first little experiment in this with some credits, some advanced credits that we gave out to people, like $300, if I remember correctly. And the thought was we were trying to encourage economic activity. Well, what a lot of people did with it was they put it either in the bank account they used to pay down a credit card. The thought was they were going to go out and spend it, and that's not what happened. It was used to reduce debt or increase savings. Some of that happened with the stimulus money. You don't, when you put the money out to a broader group, you don't necessarily know how it's going to be used. In 2008, when we had the Great Recession, most of that money didn't go to the broad public, it went to big banks. Now, there's certainly some negatives to say about that. That's definitely true. The reality was, though, was that it was going into a small number of hands to prop up the availability of capital to be able to maintain the economy overall. From that extent, it was successful. It also had very little impact on inflation because the money wasn't going out into the market chasing after goods. It led to the tremendous tech investment boom, which helped build cities like Raleigh and also continued to build Silicon Valley and stuff like that. The proliferation of mobile technology would probably not have been possible without it. But the reality is that where the money goes and who controls the money is as important as the amount of money that's out there. So you're absolutely right. Anything else?
Maybe if we go back to talking about like commitment issues as being a behavioral economics thing. If you're talking about trying to make like long-term investments under MMT and like debt fueled, it's like it can be difficult because like, okay, people, say they want to, say making an infrastructure investment. Okay, people say they want to live in a certain place for a long time, but then at a certain point, it's like their economic incentives change or gentrification happens. So that long-term planning can be still perhaps difficult because of that.
Absolutely. We can try to be as strategic as we want, but strategic thinking doesn't always work out because, as you point out, circumstances can change and people can make shifts in where they live. I mean, that's one of my concerns about the school building boom here in Wake County. There's no guarantee that there's going to be another generation full of kids to take advantage of those schools in 20 to 30 years. And when you build schools, you're building them for 50 to 60 years. You're building them for 2 to 3 generations. So I'm not saying it won't, it possibly could. The reality is you're building a lot of schools to serve a population that you currently have, but no guarantee necessarily that there's going to be that population going forward. We just have to see. We have to pray and hope that it does, because then it makes the investment worthwhile. And the money's already being spent, so you got that. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right. So I want to thank you all for your participation and attendance tonight. We have, of course, presentations are next week, April 14th. Remember to email the assignment material to me by 6 p.m. tomorrow on next Thursday. The presentations will I will go ahead and assign a group order in advance of class. And then we will go through it. Remember to follow your time limits so that we can get through all the groups tomorrow night, next Thursday, and that session will be on Zoom. Also remember that I did send out reading and lecture assignment number 3, and those responses are also due by 6 p.m. next Thursday. Are there any questions? Okay, well, that's all I have for tonight. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you all next week for presentations. Good night.
Thanks, Professor. Good night, too.
Yeah.